Going home from the hospital, when you go home empty-handed, it's a horrible feeling.
It's like feeling like if I can't have a child, I want to die.
Looking, you know, felt like I was looking everywhere for that baby.
Whatever you feel is valid, and women do really feel miscarriage as a loss.
I think it does knock down my self-esteem about being here on Earth and taking part in the things that a lot of women and families, that most people do.
So after the funeral, Kevin went off to do a job, and I was on my way home by myself. And I thought, well, I'll stop at this church that I love and light a candle. And it was a weekday morning, so I knew I'd have the place to myself. But halfway up the steps, I hear singing. And when I get to the top, I see that the place is filled with people. And then I just stand there at the back of the church with all these people trying to figure out if it would be impolite to go over and light a candle and then leave. I still really want to light this candle even though there are all these people there. So I'm just standing there, and all of a sudden this woman comes up to me, really close, and whispers very gently into my ear, "Are you a parent?" They're having a mass for the kids at the Catholic school next door.
It's such a deep grief that when women come to me and they've either had a miscarriage or they're struggling to become pregnant, I feel it all over again.
I haven't thought about this in many years, but I look back on it wondering how I ever got through those few days in the hospital.
I mean, there's practically no one that understands what I'm going through. Even my husband doesn't quite get it.
That was definitely one of the hardest things I've ever had to live through, because every day of being pregnant for 13 weeks, I felt from the minute I became pregnant that I was in this kind of a dream state. I could feel the hormones coming up. I could feel that whole thing. I could feel the baby long before people said you could feel it, like a little butterfly inside. I mean, I just could feel all those things.
I was 18 weeks pregnant, and I felt like I was getting my period. So I ended up getting out of bed. I couldn't stay in bed, and I was on the couch all night. It was a long night. I was dozing on and off and crying and talking to the baby and basically just feeling like this, it cannot be happening. This is not happening. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. And finally, at about 5 a.m, I had a moment of clarity that this was happening, that I was having a miscarriage, and that there was probably nothing that I could do about it. And what were my biggest fears? And that really helped to compartmentalize my fears, you know. My biggest fear was that the baby was alive and that I was kicking it out, that my body was rejecting it. My second biggest fear was going to the hospital. I really did not want to go to the hospital. And then I just waited for my midwife to come. And she came in the morning and looked for the heartbeat. And we couldn't find it. And she said that the baby was much smaller than it should have been. And it was clear that it had died a long time before. That was actually a comfort, because it felt like the real tragedy had happened already. And this was just the aftermath. You know, I felt like, okay, It's gone. It doesn't need to be inside me anymore.
I always felt like Rapunzel's mother. She was willing to just, eat the witch's greens, whatever it took, Go steal me those greens. Oh, I don't care what happens next. Just let me have a baby.
Well, it's like having another full-time job. I mean, you have to go to the doctor, a million times a week. You have to do the 3 injections a day we were doing. I was like black and blue and you felt like a walking pincushion.
And then I would play these games of pretending that I wasn't really trying to get pregnant this month, not really looking at the basal body temperature, pretending as if not, right? But then I'd always, by the time my period was due, be getting into these states of maybe I am, don't think about it, maybe I am, don't think about it, so that when the period would come, I'd be, again, completely devastated.
That time of the month where you really think you're pregnant and then you get your period. I mean, if I see a pregnant woman walking down the street, I'll burst into tears and have to turn around and go home. I've done that before. And especially if it's a slightly older woman, in her 40s or something, I'll just, why can't I do this? And just turn around, go home and cry. And then it's also a hormonal grief every month with the period. And then I somehow hormonally pick myself up again during ovulation, and I'm feeling better, and then you crash again. It's such a roller coaster. It's intense.
Everyone else my age were having 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. It seemed to be an established middle-class pastime 30-odd years ago. And that discouraged me, and by then I met some other women who had gone through a series of miscarriages in a similar pattern that I did, and they found a doctor who was using DES to maintain pregnancies. The problem with those shots, they soon discovered, was that DES offers cancer of the vagina to the female child.
I was completely unprepared for the pain. I had been planning for a natural childbirth at home. I read all these books, and I had become overconfident. I really thought to myself, I do yoga, I know how to breathe, I'll be fine. And it totally put me in my place. The pain was completely humbling for me. Once active labor kicked in, it took me about 2 hours to reach my breaking point. I was writhing around on the bed, drenched in sweat, naked, trying to find a position to be in, that was more comfortable than any other, and couldn't find one. I was trying to get a handle on the pain, and I couldn't. It was engulfing me, and I was terrified. So I told Kevin to page the midwife, and I crawled to the phone, and I told her, I cannot do this. I give up. I want to go to the hospital. And she said that I did not want to go to the hospital, that I was okay, and that she was on her way. For some reason, that conversation was just a total turning point. The pain did not diminish, it was increasing, and I was able to deal with it. I found a point to look at. It was actually a color. It was this shirt with there was a little shaft of light on this shirt, this pumpkin-colored shirt. And I remember so vividly how this color became my whole reason for existence, my anchor to the earth. I just breathed into this color. And it saved me.
You are unprepared for it in every way. Psychologically, physiologically, you are unprepared.
I think with a miscarriage, it's just not the woman's not pregnant long enough to really deal with labor. And then they're in labor already, and it's like, nuh-uh. And not only are they in the pain of labor, but they're in the emotional pain of, just not wanting this to happen at all. And so it's almost like sometimes pain medication is part of denial. It's like just the tangible expression of denial.
So we went to the hospital. And they just basically, they just put you in a bed and they just sort of say, well, we'll see.
Unfortunately, in my case, I stayed in the maternity ward of Trenton Hospital. And so I heard all of the loudspeaker announcements for mothers and newborn babies. And that was very discouraging and very upsetting.
And then they determined that the miscarriage was not complete, but in retrospect, they gave it no time at all to complete on its own. And so they recommended a D&C, and I think I just wasn't even... at that point, I didn't really care what they did to me. But I think the anesthesia was very detrimental. I think it completely disoriented me. I think it really made it unable for me to complete, physically, of course, but I think that if you're conscious for that physical thing, that completion, then it's easier just to complete it emotionally. As far as I knew, and I tried to, collect whatever came out, but it was mostly just clots, and so I don't know whether the baby was actually formed.
I think that might be what's the problem, is that the grieving process was interrupted because put to sleep, didn't know what happened, wasn't a part of the process. They never saw their child, and it was just some medical event thing that happened to them. They're safe and sound, but it kind of it's too mysterious. It's gone. Where's my baby? I was pregnant. How come I have nothing to show for it? There's nothing here.
After what seemed like an eternity of this, I very suddenly had to throw up. So I stumbled into the bathroom, and my body just started expelling. My stomach was expelling, my uterus was expelling. I had this urge to push, and I was pushing hard. I broke the back of the toilet, I was pushing so hard. And then it was over. And I was sitting there on the toilet, and I was flooded with endorphins and relief and euphoria that it was over. And the pain was gone.
So I had this image of the Queen of Heaven, which is also similar. It's like in Anna and Dumuzi myth, where she goes down to the underworld and they put her on a hook, and she just kind of dies there, having to stay there until the intervention, which is grace, I guess, divine grace, comes down and helps you out of that place. When you go beneath the surface, you really come up with quite a different understanding, as if you've never traveled to the lower worlds at all.
So I was sitting on the toilet, and after a while I realized that it wasn't all out, that there was something hanging out of me. And it felt like a pendulum. It was hanging and sort of swinging underneath me. And I didn't really know what to do about it, so I just sat there for a while, hoping it would solve itself, and it didn't. And finally we called the midwife, and she said, well, probably what's happened is that the baby has passed, but the placenta is still lodged in you. And if you just gently reach up and dislodge it, it should be fine. But do me a favor and save everything, because I need to make sure that it all came out. So Kevin finds an empty yogurt container, and he scoops it up while I pull it out. And then it hits me. I've just given birth. everything is small, but it's all there. Baby, umbilical cord, placenta.
It's one of those things that can be around you, but you don't see it.
It's interesting how, in so many illnesses, people tell you afterwards, after you've gone through it. Then you find out about X, Y, and Z, who never said a word.
It's like a kind of a secret underground network. You find out how many people have had miscarriages, and it's mind-boggling.
I think the secret aspect is really interesting because I visited with a friend last June, and I mentioned to her about my miscarriage, and after we talked a while, she told me she'd had 2 miscarriages, and I hadn't known that. But I thought if I hadn't mentioned mine, she never would have mentioned hers. And partly people are quiet to protect themselves because people don't respond. And I don't know, I don't want to say there's shame there, but maybe there is a little bit of shame too, and I don't know why.
He was what the modern word is supportive, but he didn't go through it. It's a very lonely pastime. And you go through it yourself, and I didn't talk about it a great deal.
Well, a lot of people don't want to hear that you're sad, or a lot of people don't want to hear that you lost your baby, and maybe that's where the shame comes in, is if people don't want to hear what you're feeling, then you must be feeling something really inappropriate.
I mean, I can still remember the nurse who came in, who I'm sure was a delightful woman, but had no clue that I was suffering to such a degree, and was so sort of cavalier with, oh, honey, it's okay, don't cry,
Oh, well, I'm sure it was a blessing, because you wouldn't have wanted to have a baby with a problem. Somebody said, oh, I'm sorry, guess what, I'm pregnant. And I think what really impressed me was that as a midwife, I had never realized how sad this is. And the people I worked with, all the people I know in childbirth, weren't able to offer support. They didn't know.
She laid out newspaper in the sink and then emptied the contents of the container onto the newspaper. And she went, oh, Lynn, have you looked at this? And I said, no. And she said, well, you really might want to look. There's a little baby here. And I didn't know what to do. My heart just stopped. But I remember that my eyes went down into the sink, and at the same time my feet took 2 steps back, like I was completely torn. Half of me was saying, okay, I really want to see. And the other half was saying, I just can't. I can't go there. But it was too late. I was already looking, and there was this little person. That's what I thought immediately, that it didn't look so much like a baby, but more like a little person. It had this incredibly delicate, bony little face and bird-like ribs sticking up through the skin. And at first I thought, oh, this is really scary. And then the fear melted away, and I was really grateful that she had given me the opportunity to know the face of my firstborn child.
What was really nice is that people actually acknowledge the baby is real. The pretense that nothing happened is the part that causes the pain, and the openness of heart that lets somebody share their pain and share their dreams is really healing.
Somehow it just needs to get acknowledged that it's a real event, So something real happened, some big loss did happen.
Somebody told me that one of the kindest things that somebody said to her was, I'm sorry you lost your baby. That's heartfelt, and it's simple, and it's all there really needs to be said.
It's a terrible experience. It's such a letdown. And I had an enormous sense of failure.
And then that feeling that you're pregnant, because the drugs make you feel like you're pregnant all the time. I mean, you're producing 12 eggs, your stomach is bloated out like, you know, you feel like you're walking around pregnant. So it did feel like a huge loss every time.
You know, if you lose a baby in the first trimester, 8 weeks, people don't acknowledge it, partly because they haven't had a chance to assimilate it, and partly because they don't realize you can have dreams and bonding that early.
But when you see that little fetus come out, you know it. There was mine right in the egg sac, complete, 9 weeks, beautiful. Wow, my body made that. Look at that, you know. Didn't make it, but it kind of makes it better somehow. Less of a failure. You know, you made something. You made something 9 weeks worth, but you made something.
And they called me at midnight to tell me that she had passed the baby. And for her, fortunately, she was in the bed, so she had the baby intact to grieve over and to bury. That was actually really quite profound for them. They told me later that they were glad that that had happened that way. And we're glad that they hadn't gone to the hospital.
When I was little, we had this neighbor who apparently had a miscarriage. We never knew what it was called, but their family had 5 kids and our family had 5 kids, and all the kids were talking about the baby that was just as big as a pinky. The baby that died that was just as big as a pinky. It was this very magical baby. We were all grieving over this baby. And I think that maybe one child got told the story by the mother, and somehow it became this little mythological creature, and it was so profound to all of us.
We had a funeral for it in Central Park. Kevin found a beautiful little box that was shaped like a womb, a little oval box. And we put flower petals in it and sage and a picture of ourselves on our wedding day and the positive pregnancy test. And we lit a candle and then we wrote notes to it. And we put an ivy plant over the spot.
There's nothing written for that, is there? I burned that little piece of tissue with some rosemary and with some hair from each of our heads. My husband and I each wrote something and said a blessing on the baby. It was restful. And after that, I was able to plug in the phone again. You have to make it up yourself, because the rest of the world pretends it didn't happen.
I guess that's also a place of forgiveness, you know, of just living in that one day at a time, but yet trying for what you want and seeing what will unfold, but taking cues from the things that do unfold in your life.
I always knew it was an option. I mean, I always knew that I have a pretty big heart. I mean, I always knew I could open my heart enough to adopt, but I don't know why. I don't know what happened in this fertility thing. Maybe it's because you're on all these drugs that you get really crazy, but you really start to want one of your own. And I guess you just get into it's like a big blur. It's like now that I'm out of it, and with Usha, I just said, what, you know, in hindsight, of course, but when you're in it, there's no way to see out clearly. I just love her so. I mean, I just can't imagine a better experience. You know? I mean, I'm in heaven, total heaven.
I'm feeling a lot more surrender about it. You know, I can see my life without children. I can see maybe my life with, you know, an adopted child, or I can see my life giving birth and having my own child. And all of them are becoming okay with me.
those core issues that show you who you are. And if you can stay with it through those things, labor and being with somebody who's dying and being with somebody in labor and miscarriage and being in that and going beyond where you think you can go with it, then you come out the other end in a different place. You become transformed by it.
Without sounding really egotistical, it's like the lessons of a master. I mean, you have to be pretty strong and pretty tough, you know, to go through all these difficulties and come out healed. So I feel like I've been given this because I really feel that this is like a schoolhouse, you know, the earth is, and we're here to learn and grow, and maybe I'm getting a master's degree rather than just a mere college degree.